I'm Donald Farmer, and I'm an independent advisor to enterprises and investors and vendors on data and analytics strategy. I've been doing this for a long time, and it's been a great pleasure for me to work with Domo and introduce some panel discussions and to do some videos. You may have seen our Curiosity video series, which was a lot of fun to do. And I was really enjoying the conversations that we've been able to have around the areas of data and analytics. And today I'm joined by some great people to take that conversation a bit further. We have Mark Drenka from Grant Thornton, Mark Runyon from On24, and April Weitzel from UPMC. And I know they're going to be, very, very interesting kind of topics that they can dig into and give us some guidance, some advice from their experience, from their very varied applications of data and analytics in their organization. And the subject we're going to talk about this afternoon is persuasion and influence. And that seems to me such an interesting subject because whenever we use data, whenever we use analytics in an organization, especially when we use, say, data visualization or dashboards, we do it with a particular purpose. And that purpose may be just to discover things, but more often the purpose is actually to make decisions. And we don't make decisions on our own. At least we don't make decisions in isolation. We make decisions typically collaboratively, or at least in consultation with other people. And so a large part of our work involves helping other people to help us make better decisions, collaborating with other people, and bringing data and analytics into that process. So the use of data as a way of persuading, in the way of influencing others, I think is going to be a very important skill for us to develop. And the best cases that I've seen of companies that have been able to transform themselves with data and analysis have used persuasion and influence as an important part of that. So to dig into that, I'd love to start just sort of with a very open question. Mark Drenka, I think let's start with you. Only because you're in the top left-hand side of my screen. I don't know where you are on anyone else's screen, but for me, you're in the top left-hand side, so easy to go clockwise. So Mark, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, your role in the organization and the role in particular of what your use of data implies and how you use data for persuasion and influence within that role.
Yeah, thanks, Donald. No, I appreciate being here. I think that's a great question. And just a quick background on myself. I'm a senior manager within Grant Thornton, which is a professional services firm. We're public accounting, and there's a whole gambit of service offerings that we have from audit, advisory, and tax. And even within tax, there's a lot of different areas that somebody can specialize in. And I lead a portion of our tax digital consulting group that focuses on data transformation and analytics. And this is just an area that we've seen take off the last couple of years. For anybody who's not overly familiar with what tax department and organization does, it's very similar to any other overhead department. It's very limited resources, limited budget, and the department, the users in the department, a lot of them come from obviously a formal accounting background, a tax background. And they went to school for this. That's what they enjoy doing. And they get into these different roles, and they are just inundated with large amounts of data. So they think about it, you have to take data from all these different aspects of the company, whether it's HR, payroll, revenue, expenses, and you have to report on that information and hand that across to different regulators in terms of a tax return, a provision, your estimated payments. We're right in that time right now for individual returns, and
yes,
companies are the same pain points. And really, what we see is just they're dealing with all of this data, and they're not overly comfortable with using a lot of advanced technology. They're almost in a way intimidated by using it. So we see them migrating towards basic tools that are easy to understand, like Excel. And before you know it, it's multiple spreadsheets with large, sum ifs, VLOOKUPs, pivot tables that are just spread across the organization.
Right. But they're comfortable with what they know.
Exactly. So it's kind of that change management. And then we'll come in and say, hey, Excel is fantastic. We love it. works really, really well, and it's pretty much the universal language for accounting. But hey, it might not always be the best tool to use for certain processes. And that's when we introduce them to a lot of technologies like Domo, saying, hey, you don't have to be, we understand you went to school for accounting, that's great, that's what your organization needs, but you don't have to be that MIS major, you don't have to be that IT guru. You just have to have some level of knowledge of adopting a new technology that can make your life easier. And that's where we really see, a product like Domo coming in to be extremely valuable. It's not always the fancy dashboards, the visualizations, those are great. But in terms of what we see for tax departments, they're saying, hey, can you save me hours of time? So I'm not up
Right.
at 11:30 at night trying to crank out a tax return. Can you save me time from this Excel spreadsheet? Yeah, we can. We can show you a lot of these technologies that are very easy to use. So as far as the literacy piece goes, it's introducing this concept of there is a better way to do this. And it's made leaps and bounds over the last couple of years, and you don't have to be that guru to handle it. So that's kind of what we see. It's just targeting individuals within that tax department and letting them know that there are solutions out there that can help them.
That's great. That's super interesting, and it really resonates with me personally because about 20 years ago I worked at Microsoft, and of course I worked very closely with the Excel team. And one of the things I was very aware of when I was doing that was, of course, Excel is the do everything tool, but in some ways that also means I don't think it's a do nothing tool, but it lacks focus, it lacks intention, and therefore you could be an Excel expert. You can do almost anything with it, but it's actually very difficult to bring a focus to it, and it's very difficult to then therefore drive decisions with it because it's a great tool for exploration, but it doesn't have the structure that a tool like Domo has to kind of clarify your thinking. And I think one of the great things about business intelligence and about the work that Domo's done is helping people to clarify their own thoughts in order to have more interesting thoughts and then work and persuade beyond that. April, I'd love to know a little bit more about what you do and your role and how data and analytics plays into the persuasion and the influence that you have or that your peers have in your organization.
Yeah, sure. So UPMC, we're a hospital organization, $23 billion revenue. We have 92,000 employees, and we're in the United States, China, pardon me, Italy, Ireland, and even Kazakhstan. So we are data driven to an extreme. We have about 58 platforms in our system that covers, I'm on the marketing side, so it covers the digital spend, traditional media, as well as patient data and insurance data. So we, our team, in the marketing intelligence department and responsible for the analytics. So we marry our marketing spend to our patient volumes to see how our marketing spend has influenced patient volumes, increases, decreases, however you want to see it. In the age of COVID, it's been especially important for us to see influences of marketing. For example,
right.
Literally the hospital system shut down selective, elective surgeries. So we had to come up with ways to reach out to people to tell them they can still see their doctors.
To persuade them it's safe to come in. And...
Exactly. So we were coming up with a video visits campaign. And what that is seeing your doctor virtually. So we had to really hone in on who the target audience was for that and reach them and then see the influence in the patient calls to our hospital systems.
Gosh. That's that's a great example of influence because you have to use data and an analysis to understand who the target market is for talking to these people, and then you need to persuade them. That's very directed. That's great.
Yeah, well, and you kind of changed the dynamic of how people interact with their doctor now with CP, because people weren't adopting the virtual visit as much prior to the pandemic, but now we've seen an increase, and it's been a steady increase.
Right, and you can track that and learn for the future. I assume in some ways things will not go back to normal in the sense that they won't go back to the status quo ante. There will be in a new world in which these virtual visits will be more common.
Right.
Oh, fascinating. So, I mean, we've had an accountancy company joining us in the middle of tax season. We have a hospital company joining us in the middle of a pandemic. I mean, no pressure, Mark Runyon. What do you do, and how does data and persuasion work in your business?
Thanks, Donald, for the introduction. Yeah, so I am in revenue operations for On24, as you mentioned, and that department in itself is the marketing operations, sales operations, and customer success. And a lot of my time spent with marketing operations and Domo and a lot of operational efficiency for sure. Like to get people out of Excel, you mentioned that. Looking for insights into our funnel, where there might be an issue, trying to resolve them, gaining insight. So we spent a lot of time with the marketing team with targets, trying to figure out how to look at which campaigns are more successful than others. And really helping the sales team understand where they are and where they need to be. And I think that we talked about a little bit too, when you talk about getting persuasion and influence, getting the data and the data literacy right. We do some stuff, of course, with data dictionaries. We're working on that. There's little things you can do like tagging fields with definitions. But I'm going to start doing some definitions of like what's a marketing funnel. What's the difference between SQL and MQL? Everybody kind of has the idea of what those are from different companies they worked at, but it comes down to the data and what those things mean at your company. It's sometimes a little bit different. So getting everybody on the same page is super important on the data literacy and what all that stuff means.
That's fascinating. I'm going to, I really want to dig into some things that you said there, because I love this idea that tagging data is a way of effectively nudging people in the right direction to use it and to use it effectively. I think that's a super interesting idea. So I think one thing that I'm taking away already is that there's a wide range of meanings and purpose behind the idea of influence and the use of data to influence. We have the influence of data inside an organization to encourage people to use analytic tools in order to encourage people to think more analytically, make better decisions. We have the use of persuasion, perhaps in a very direct way, to persuade people via marketing. That seems a very natural use of persuasion that people will readily understand. It's super interesting. We do have a chat panel. And I'd really like to encourage people, now that you have a sense of where the conversation's going, to by all means ask your questions in the chat panel, and we'll try to get to them. If we can't get to them as we go along, we'll try to get to them towards the end, but I'll be keeping an eye on the panel there and see what's happening. And we have almost 160 people on the call, so I hope some of you have got some interesting questions for us and for the panel. April, I want to come back to something you said, because what Mark Runyon mentioned there about sort of tagging data and making data available, and he was talking about people understanding things like SQL from previous jobs that they've got. Clearly, within an organization, not everyone is at the same technical level. People have different depths and breadths of technical understanding. And in marketing, some people may be very, very focused on business intelligence because they've used it before or they've learned it on the job. Others will be the Excel experts and so on. How do you tackle the problem, if you like, of bringing everyone to a level where you can communicate to them effectively with data in an organization? Is that something you've had to face?
Yes, very much so. So the way our hospital organization is structured, we can market by campaign, we can market by service line, or we can market by hospital or region. So we've developed a process on the back end, tagging, to Mark's point, of ingesting that data to be filterable via hospital, via campaign, via service line, via geography. So we've done a lot of work on the back end to get that in place. So on the front end dashboards, people can, filter down and see their campaigns. They can see their geo they're responsible for, or their service line that they're responsible for. So we've put a lot of emphasis on filtering. So I always like to go back to the Amazon shopping, example, where you filter down to what it is you're searching for, and your data is there. So that has helped in the clinical marketing organization, where they can filter down because they're responsible for service lines. So like cardiovascular for service line, for example, heart surgeries, They can see all of their campaigns in totality via hospital and the regions that they're marketing to. So
Well, I like the Amazon example you used because that's a very familiar one to everyone. You know, data is categorized, and you can use categorization in order to explore effectively. And I can see how that's doing that works within your organization. But we do have a question though about how do you document your data tags and other metadata? That seems to me actually quite interesting. How do people know what's available, or does it just show up in the interface for them?
it shows up in the filters. So, the filters are searchable, for example. But to Mark's point, we have a data dictionary for, the clinical marketing group and work with our partners, our agency partners, our media buying agency to tag and ingest the data properly so we can visualize it on the front end in Domo.
That's great. So people have there is a kind of guide to this if people need
Absolutely.
it that you can use. Mark Drenka, do you have anything similar, or is this a familiar story to you about tagging and metadata and the importance of making that available to people?
Yeah, definitely. I think, a scenario we run into pretty often is everything seems to be scattered all over the place, depending on, what the organization's dealing with. They've got different data. They don't know, hey, there's 20 versions of Excel over here. Am I looking at the latest and greatest? What exactly needs to occur here to make sure I'm looking at the source of truth? So definitely bringing in data to, start tagging that as, hey, here is your latest run of data out of multiple ERP systems with, specifically on the tax side, a lot of times we end up tagging that and mapping that to a list of, tax sensitized accounts. So you think about a company with huge general ledger, thousands and thousands of accounts. Something that tax departments always struggle with is, hey, what are all the accounts here that roll up into this particular subgroup of an actual, top consolidated account? We need a better picture of, what's all tax sensitized, so I can make really, really quick decisions whenever there is a merger, an acquisition, a new revenue regulation that comes out from, any form of, federal or local government. So tagging that data, getting that single source of truth housed in one area, like the data lake within Domo, very, very helpful, and actually a pretty big pain point we run into when it's not done that way for a lot of organizations.
Right. That's great. And we have a question online about somebody asking, about asking you particularly, Mark Drenko, about how you persuade accountants to move away from Excel into a more kind of structured data world. And I don't want to answer for you, but what I'm hearing in your current kind of conversation is that, in fact, that you couldn't possibly do that consolidation. You couldn't possibly do that roll up in Excel because it just isn't a structured data system. By its nature, it's everything is independent within the Excel world. So actually, the value and very often the necessity of governing data and having good compliance is only possible if you use a structured data set, which Excel is just not suitable for. So I can imagine that being one form of persuasion. Any other tips and tricks you would give to someone who's trying to get their accountants to maybe not give up on Excel, but to move more towards a structured analytics system like Domo?
Yeah, no, one of the biggest ones, I mentioned before, like, hey, can you save me hours in my day? Fantastic. That's always a great item. But on top of that, what, we see maybe somebody at the higher level, like a C-suite, is, hey, I want to make sure we have a handle on all of our risks. And if we have all of these processes that are manual formulas, manual cutting, copying, pasting, filtering, sorting, whatever it is in Excel, how do I know that the end result coming out of these work papers is correct? So biggest thing that we tend to focus on is mitigating risk by inserting automated processes that are well documented, easy to follow, easy for an auditor to go back and look at. And two, like we said before, it's just a time savings at that point. So I see the question in there, what tips would you give the accountants? It's really trying to get the message across that there is a better way to do this. You can save yourself a lot of stress and time. And two, you can make the process a lot less, prone to error by introducing a lot of the automation. So that's usually what we start with. Start with something very, very simple, and then start to build on top of that. So it's really simple process, get a quick win. Hey, what worked, what didn't work? What could we lump into the second use case? Okay, great. And we kind of start to see adoption built from there. So
Right. Yeah.
that's what
Yeah.
we do.
Quick win is always valuable, isn't it? To show the value quickly. I think that's one of the areas where Domo has been very successful, in all the Domo customers that I've spoken to, is that they've had quick wins, and a quick win then consolidates and it expands out of there. Mark Runyon, I'm wondering about the adoption of Domo within your organization. How did you see it adopting? And I mean, Domo in itself, but also in a broader sense, the use of data and analysis for influence. Do you have any kind of anecdotes about how Domo spread
Sure.
in your organization?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'd follow up real quickly on one of Mark's comments too, which was the Excel. One of the things I like about Domo is it's a full suite. You know, you've got the reporting analytics on the front. It's also got the kind of data lake and data warehouse, but you've got the ETL tools, which have been pretty powerful to automate some of that data that's tougher to do in some applications like Excel. It's a big time saver to be able to transform some of that data. But yeah, so one of our primary use cases is helping the marketing demand gen team and the campaign, that team creating those campaigns and monitoring them in combination with Salesforce and our front end marketing automation system. And of course, our application itself is a very marketing focused data engagement tool. But putting all that data together and getting the different demand gen team looking at their own campaigns and that own performance, I built sort of a self-service portal for them for data versus letting them, I don't totally let them be free and say you can build anything you want, because, you know, but at the same time, I want to be able to make their needs. And we have weekly calls now saying, well, what are some of the issues? But they'll be able to look up their own SQLs, dive into, use the different dynamic filters at the top of Domo, be able to get their own data for themselves and come up with some of their own conclusions. And important to that, critical to that is, you know, data validity and credibility. Right. So that they can do that themselves. And they come back to me, and if there's a question, we don't see odd data things pop up. So there's some monitoring of the system, and it's really enabling that team to do some of their own.
Yeah, so there's this interesting mix of you centrally having to provision the good data, and then there's a self-service side where the emphasis has to be on the self, on the individual who's wanting then to develop their skills and their use of data. And that's interesting.
Right. And enabling that literacy with them is going to make them more, you know, more useful and more powerful to be able to do that. And
then they develop around them. People will develop around them who know them and who see that they're doing well, and they'll become a little center of influence. You know, I'm looking out of my studio window this morning, and it's spring here in the Pacific Northwest, and I can see that last year's daffodil bulbs are now starting to come up. The healthy ones are coming up in groups. You know, it's not just one. They've now split up into 2 and 3, and I've got little clusters. And within a year or two, you know, we'll talk about that slope that we planted as being naturalized. And I kind of like the idea that we naturalize data and analytics in an organization. It starts with a process of enabling data, and I think you make a great point about enabling the data, but also enabling the individual to serve themselves. And then over time, this will just become a natural process within the organization. Mark, you used the phrase data literacy quite a lot, and I like that phrase. It's been a very popular phrase in the last kind of couple of years. I think people are somewhat puzzled by it sometimes. Not everybody has a good idea of what it means. Do you have a definition of it that you use, or is it just a convenient term that people adopt?
Which part are you talking to me?
Yeah, Mark Runyon. Sorry.
I mean, I think that whether it's data literacy or just better collaboration on when you're talking about data, how do you have a conversation that's we're all on the same page so we can get to the same insights? And if we do enable people to do that, you know, I want to be able to present something with, you know, MQL, SQL, conversion rates, you know, time, on the funnel, and not have them look at me blank in the eye. We need to be able to have a conversation about it, because you know, sometimes I don't know the conclusion, and there's a lot of qualitative things, and so that's not just quantitative. You got to get certain groups together for a good collaborative decision making and action, right? So for me, whether it's that term or just being able to have a good conversation language around data.
And collaboration is essential to that. I mean, I think one of the things about data literacy is, if just like ordinary literacy, if you're going to write something, the receiving person has to be able to read it. So it's a two-way skill, and collaboration seems very critical. April, I was wondering if you have within your organization a concept of data literacy, either formally or informally, and how do you use that to spread, to naturalize analytics within your organization? Does that make sense to you, to put it that
Yeah,
way?
yeah, absolutely. So we define data literacy simply as the user of the data being able to ask the right questions
Right.
and to understand what data is relevant and can influence the business outcomes they desire. We also think, interpreting the data to recommend campaign optimizations is important, and being able to interpret the results of campaigns to use in future campaigns to increase their chance of success. We also think that our users being able to develop and test hypotheses to impact future campaigns is also important, because that shows us that they really do understand the data in front of them, and which levers impact which outcomes, so to speak.
Yeah.
And
Testing hypotheses. That's actually almost formalized when you put it in those terms. But very important.
exactly, because we have a lot of campaigns that run every year. Like Check Your Heart Month, breast cancer
Right.
awareness. So there's a lot of campaigns that we can really solidify hypothesis and testing those to make the campaign better year after year. And so then we also think of it as, are the users able to present data and the visualizations to their leaders and understand the results if they're asked questions about those? And then, can they tell the story using the data to show what the results were of their campaigns?
Right. Yeah.
Executive management.
So there's actually a very specific set of skills that your team need to have in order to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. And the audience that they have to deliver this data to is hospital presidents and very successful surgeons and doctors who are very demanding in terms of their expectations of what marketing can do for them. So they have to be able to quickly and succinctly explain their case using data.
Right. They have to answer difficult questions as well, I'm sure. Interesting. So one of the questions that we have in the chat panel is asking about how do we document these processes, these skills that your team need to have, and how would you apply that to either skills transfer or onboarding perhaps new team members who need to adopt those tools? Do you have documentation? Do you have a handbook? Do you have a process for doing that, or is it more informal and sort of peer to peer?
We have a process in terms of onboarding. So everybody that gets onboarded has to take a training on the two main dashboards we offer, which are the service line and campaign dashboards and the web analytics dashboards. There's also pro tip documentation that goes along with those dashboards for future reference after they take the training. And we also offer up weekly office hours for people to come in and ask any question they have related to the tool, related to the data. A lot of those questions come around. Am I pulling this data correctly? Is this the data I should look at to make a decision with?
Right. Excellent. Yeah. So I mean, I think if I think of the hospital world, of course, you're in a very regulated industry, and there's requirements like HIPAA around privacy. So I can imagine there has to be documentation around that to make sure that people are behaving correctly and compliant. Mark Drenka, in your world, it must be kind of similar, because I should think accounting is, by its definition, tax accounting is a very legalistic area in terms of its processes. How do you bring people on board and skill them up with not only the kind of formal aspects of accounting and data analysis and the structure of the accounts that you've been talking about? That seems like quite a challenge, but even the informal aspects of how they communicate with data and how they use data to influence. Do you have a process for doing that? Do you have anything formalized or documented that helps?
Yeah, I think no, that's a really good question. To shift it from what our firm does and more gear it towards what we see companies dealing with. a lot of times when a new user comes in, say whether they're straight out of school or they're coming from another company and they get onboarded, a lot of times it's, here, let me give you the whole inventory of our systems, our deliverables, our filing footprint, everything we're dealing with, open audits, whatever it is. Here's all our work papers. You know, huge, probably overwhelming education
Yeah, that's
session.
overload. Yeah, for sure.
And from there, it's always specific to organizations of, okay, you know, for the most part, it's simplified. We have to gather up all of our data. We have to report all of our revenues, our expenses in whatever format. It could be direct tax, could be indirect tax, whatever it really is. But a lot of times we see, you know, companies inserting these new folks and they are just drilling through these complex work papers with hardly any documentation behind it. And that's where we see, again, a huge risk factor of, all right, well, we've got one number at the back here. Here's your trial balance. Let me trace that through about 30 different sheets of an Excel workbook through multiple formulas. And that's where we see a lot of companies kind of get into a little bit of trouble. Maybe it's not documented that well. And again, back to Excel is great, but it's also sometimes difficult to figure out what exactly is going on. What logic are you using here? And that's
Right.
when you start to see Domo, it's almost got built-in documentation with it. So, hey, I don't have to trace a nested if formula across
Right.
multiple sheets, but I can actually follow a tile and read exactly how you're changing the data to get it to the format that we need. So a lot of times we do see companies struggle to maintain documentation just because of constantly changing regulations, scenarios, different work papers, updated work papers, and having all of that brought into one centralized location with built-in, you know, annotations and tiles telling you literally left to right, what are you doing? It's a lot easier to follow. And that's kind of where we
There's a
see
sort of workflow to it that can be built
exactly.
into the, yeah, that's
Yep.
fascinating.
Yep. And
Yeah,
that's
you know,
where kind
there's,
of, oh,
yeah,
sorry, I was just going to say the auditors are starting to shift in that direction too. So we've got a lot of experts now starting to understand, you know, the workflow functions and trying to follow data that way.
wow. That's great. That's a great example of how of the distinction between a well-structured analytic tool and something that is just freeform and powerful like Excel, but something which is actually structured can give you even greater analytic power because it can guide you and guide you through the process and give you some confidence in that process. You know, there's a super interesting question on the chat panel about the communication techniques that we use with data and whether they're different if you have in-person conversations about data or if you're having kind of presentations to a group, for example. There's a fascinating book called The Leader's Voice by Clark and Crosland. I'm not sure if it's still in print, but it's a few years old. But they set out what they called the quadrant of communication. And the quadrant of communication was divided in two axes, one of which was public and private communication, and the other axis was direct and indirect. And so public direct communication would be, you know, talking to a large group of people where they can interact with you. To a certain extent, we're having a public and direct conversation here. Public and indirect might be publishing a memo and sharing it amongst a lot of people. Private and indirect would be sending an email, and private and direct would be having a conversation. So, and one of the things that they suggest, and I've always found this very valuable in my own work, is that, you know, you can't just use one of those quadrants. Really good communicators learn to use all of those quadrants and learn to use them all creatively and learn to use the right one for the right purpose. But Mark Runyon, in the conversation we were having earlier, you were talking about how the importance of self-service in your work and how analysts sort of take on, having been given data, having been provisioned with good quality data, they can then serve themselves to their own analytics and often drive their own agenda when it comes to data and analysis. When it then comes to communicating that, is this something that you notice in your organization, or are the people making findings? I tend to find in a lot of organizations, all this analytic work that is done ends up somehow as a PowerPoint and it's kind of dead and not really engaged with. And I'm wondering if you've seen ways of engaging people in a more fluent way across the whole spectrum of communication. That's a big question, I'm afraid, but
Yeah, I don't know that I have a silver bullet for it, but look, to some degrees, the PowerPoint's not, it's not completely gone. I mean, I do like the PowerPoint plugin that Domo's got. If nobody's used that, it's actually been a very helpful changer from taking away some of the mechanics and getting some of these dashboards or PowerPoints together with multiple slides and making it focus on the results. So one
interesting.
of my old bosses told me to, and when we were doing an analysis, say it's 6 slides on a problem or a question that somebody's asked, I like to get the graph right, but also I very much put some of my notes about what I believe that some of the observations about that that graph and that data, so that we can have a conversation about that.
Right. Not enough just to give them the graph. You have to give some of your color commentary on it as well. So
Yeah,
people can
absolutely.
guide
Because
the
sometimes,
conversation.
data without context or without a story, right? People talk about data story. It's not. It's more difficult, and I'm in a position, and some of my peers are in a position to be able to help guide that without, people. When you can self-serve, sometimes you can get the opposite, which is they can see it and just don't understand what's going on. So do that, and then we're very much important to us is figuring out what the action items are, next steps, and we're constantly thinking about what is this telling us, what's the right thing to do, and what course of action for improvement, because that's really what we're trying to do, is constant improvement based on data and where we're at, given what we know.
That is super interesting. I like your point very much that just presenting the data to people, and I absolutely take your point about the Domo integration with PowerPoint and its ability to kind of structure that into stories. But the need to add commentary. Domo has features, for example, for having a chat window where you can actually have a conversation about the dashboard, the cards that people are looking at. That seems to be to address some of those questions about how you can add comment and how you can engage others with that. April, are you using any techniques like this? Do you have any sort of tips and tricks for communication in this way?
Yeah, so ours is more traditional. Right now we do what we call campaign check-ins. We do those bi-weekly,
All right.
where we have the campaign owner present their campaign using Domo to an audience of that consists of marketing intelligence department, the paid media agency, the creative agency, and the clinical marketing department. So we're really putting emphasis on people using the dashboards and feeling comfortable presenting that way. And what we've found in this day and age is people are really self-aware of how they're being perceived on camera. And so I think it's going to benefit when we go back into the office with people being much more aware of how they can present to the audience when, because now you're looking at your facial expressions, you're looking at your hand movements and things like that. So I think people are going to be more confident, if you will, going back into the office and being able to present using Domo as the backdrop for the data to tell the stories.
That's a fascinating observation, and I hadn't really thought of this before, that we are becoming used to a kind of mode of communication where we present to each other. And it's a little artificial because we're presenting on screen. Conversations we previously have had in the corridor around a water cooler, we're now having in this rather somewhat artificial, but we've got so used to it that it's become natural for us. That's fascinating. I think that's super interesting. Mark Drenka, I was wondering about your organization. There's a question about data science, and it's somewhat one of the challenges of data science, in fact, is the difficulty of communicating the results of data science. In particular, we've seen people emerging as sometimes called a data interpreter, somebody who's actually able to interpret analytics to other people and tell the story in a persuasive, or at least in an easy to understand way, or a simple to understand way. Now, in your organization, it's highly technical in a sense. It's very, very involved, and people will be very expert in particular uses of data when it comes to accounting. Do you have any advanced analytics capabilities? Are there people in your organization who either emerge naturally as particular experts, or do you have a formalized data science function? And if so, can you tell us anything about how that fits in with the kind of topic we've been following of persuasion and influence?
Yeah, no, I think for the most part, what we typically see is a lot of folks have that technical accounting tax background, and they don't really know a whole lot about the technology side of the house. But one thing that's been really coming around the last couple of years is now getting folks with an MIS background or more of a I would say data literacy who know a lot more about these systems. Because like right now, I remember even the first Domo conference we went to, it was like right over everybody's head when they started going into really technical items. It was like, I don't know what this is. I'm having a hard time understanding how this fits into my everyday job. And so, what we're seeing in the industry is obviously still a lot of, folks out of school coming through as actual accounting majors, but it's now starting to blend in with a lot of these technical skills with MIS majors. So it's kind of, learn as you go in a way. But I would kind of, as far as that chat question there, it's like, how do you help communicate this? And Donald, I heard you say, in a simple form, that's exactly what we do. Because I remember it was a couple of years ago, everyone was like, okay, this is a little too technical for us. So we just said, let's back off the technical aspect of it and instead just try to demonstrate, hey, so-and-so, I know you might not be familiar with, SQL, Python, R, all of that probably just sounds like jumbled up jargon to somebody with a tax background. But if I can show you side by side, here's a process in a new type of technology like Domo, here's your process that you were doing in Excel, and we just go mirror for mirror, like, here's what you're doing. Exactly. So here's your time savings, here's your risk mitigation. And that's really the messaging we try to get across is just, no, let's not overwhelm somebody. We don't want anybody deer in the headlights here when we're talking about it. Let's just try to make it as simple as possible. And that's really what's resonated well with kind of the industry.
Yeah, Mark Runyon, do you have people who've emerged in your organization as Domo experts who can then, go that step further and become really proficient and therefore then lead others in the organization by example to do more complex work?
I mean, the Marketo admin who works for me, David, he's taken on Domo, and he knows the format and the structure of Marketo, so he's started to learn quite a bit. Got someone from customer success who's jumping in because we also use Domo to combine different data sources from our platform, from Marketo, from Salesforce, from our customer success, from finance to do campaign ROI. We're actually, we've had a couple of people emerge, and then we're also actually hiring too. So we've got 2 job recs out there, one for a data manager and one for a Domo admin. So
good.
We're committed and know that we want to consolidate this data because the needs are high, and it's important to get the right people in there to help grow.
Yeah, that's exciting. Yeah,
because once something takes on, people see the quality of the data, the information they get, the analytics they can get. It's not just marketing anymore. It's
absolutely
product marketing. It's a bunch of people want to be able to pull this together. Now finance wants to be able to merge it, our campaign data with our finance data. So with a
it becomes a practice within the organization.
Yeah. And so we work with a great consultant as well from Domo to help us do some of that as well on the ETL side too.
Good. And April, do you have any kind of last thoughts on the process of persuasion and influence with data in your organization? Any last tip that you could give with us?
Yeah, sure. So my department, the marketing intelligence department, we are those experts. I'm actually the Domo within the organization. But when we want it to further expand, we look to see which department has a champion, if you will, which person is really engaged and really wants to learn the tool and has kind of stepped up to the plate and expressed interest. So then we have individual training sessions with them so they can go and, it's the, teach the teacher methodology. So they're teaching the other people in their department. And it's almost like, so it's your peer, and it's not somebody from another department telling you what to do, so to speak.
Right. That is so important, isn't it? And I think this has come up a number of times in our conversation, that persuasion and influence isn't top down. It's not we're influencing down, we're influencing across. And we're actually developing a shared practice, which seems to be very, very important. You know, this has been a wonderful conversation. We could go on for a lot longer, but we were very limited in time. I want to thank you all very much for taking part and for bringing such openness and candor to a fascinating area. Thank you for all the people who attended, and I hope you have a great time the rest of the conference. Thanks very much.